In this series, we're answering the question, what is the gospel? We said that the gospel is the good news story of God and creation, a story by God about how God is light, life, and love, and a story that invites us to partner with God as he makes a way for creation to come back to life in his very goodness. And today's story is like a lot, so hang in there. This episode is like the moment we've all been waiting for. So before we get into it, let's remember what's happened so far. First, God created the world, and we learned the truth that very goodness comes from God. We learned that when we live in this truth, we can live the lives of self-sacrifice and forgiveness and rest that we were made for. But soon, a serpent tricked humanity into believing the big lie, that humanity has to make their own very goodness. And we learned that when we live under the power of this lie, we live lives of self-preservation and unforgiveness and striving. In other words, lives being tumbled around in an inescapable cycle of sin. So God made a plan to inspire humans to trust him again and bring us back to life in his very goodness by making a partnership deal with a human family called Israel. According to the deal, God would bless Israel so that they could pass the cake and share God's very goodness with the world. And even though God's promise was forever and no matter what, and even though God promised to cover both sides of the deal with his own blood, Israel could not live the life in this truth while they still feared death. Which leaves us with a question. How could God, who wasn't vulnerable to death, gain the trust of his human family? In our last video, we learned how God became human in the life of Jesus of Nazareth, how he became the truth in every way, trusting in God's very goodness, making himself vulnerable to death, and keeping his promise to bless the world through Israel by being born into a Jewish family and living a Jewish life. We heard how he built a community of followers, 12 disciples just like the 12 tribes of Israel, and retaught the lessons of the desert, relationship, reliance, and living upside down from the rest of the world. But unlike the desert, God was in relationship with Israel in a way they could actually understand. With his human life in his human body, he taught and lived according to the truth that very goodness comes from God alone. And his mode of living was so upside down, it baffled everyone around him. And when God himself lives the truth perfectly in the world, he brings new life everywhere he goes. People are healed, lives are restored, and a whole new reality emerges. And that brings us to today's episode, where it kind of looks like God's plan might fall apart. Jesus' ministry was successful because he was living in a human body. But human bodies don't last forever. How could God inspire his people once and for all to trust in his very goodness? How could he prove that he loved them enough to always bless them? How could he show that he was powerful enough to overcome the fear of death that had made them believe the lie in the first place? How could Jesus bring the world into this totally new reality, into the truth, into the kingdom of God for good? He was going to have to turn the whole world upside down. And that's exactly what he did during the last week of his life. First, on the Sunday before his death, Jesus took on the lie that very goodness comes from domination and power. He entered Jerusalem not on a noble steed surrounded by a royal guard, but on a donkey, with a band of fishermen and tax collectors and other outsiders. But the people of Jerusalem knew the truth and welcomed him as king. And Jesus turned kingship upside down. Later that week, Jesus took on the lie that very goodness comes from money. He entered the temple courts where people were taking advantage of the sacrificial system to make money off those who wished to honor God. He literally flipped the sellers' tables upside down and proclaimed the truth that God and not money was the source of very goodness. For the rest of the week, he took on the lie that Israel's status as chosen and their possession of Torah was the way to very goodness. He reminded anyone who would listen that very goodness was meant to come through Israel, not to Israel alone. He taught that when Israel wore God's promise as a badge of honor to exclude and failed to actually be the blessing to the nations, when they bragged about their access to the cake instead of passing it along, they were doing the opposite of what God's forever and no matter what promise was supposed to do. He turned upside down what it meant to be God's people and the world's idea of who God's promises were really for. And his presence and his actions and his teaching were dangerous to those who were trying to preserve life under the lie. And so a group of chief priests and elders, the ones who loved living the lie more than they wanted to live in God's truth, plotted to kill him. But Jesus knew it was coming. And what's more, he was ready for it. Because he had turned the power of kingship and wealth and religious status on its head. But now it was time to turn death itself upside down, to prove his forever and no matter what love and commitment to blessing the world by covering both sides of the deal that he had made so long ago, and to defeat the power behind the lie forever. On Thursday night, the night in which Jesus was betrayed, he gave his disciples one final lesson on what it really meant to live in God's truth. He showed them that living life according to the truth would always look upside down to those who were living the lie. He showed them that in the blessed life, the master serves the servant by washing his disciples' feet. He commanded them to love one another as I have loved you. And then he used the bread and the wine of the Passover meal to prepare them for understanding that this as I have loved you love would involve sacrifice. They didn't get it yet, but they were about to. That night, Jesus and his disciples went to a garden to pray. In the garden, Jesus, who knew he was about to face a terrible death, asked his disciples to stay awake with him. And while they were there, Jesus asked the Father the same question I think we all ask about the crucifixion of Jesus. Did it really have to happen? Couldn't we just understand the truth from Jesus' life? Did we really need God to follow through and cover both sides of the deal? Did Jesus really have to die? Jesus asked this of the Father 3 times. And every time he came back to his disciples, the ones that he had asked to stay awake, they had fallen asleep. It was clear Jesus' life wasn't enough. God's human partners were never going to be able to live up to their side of the deal unless something really big changed. And just moments later, that big change got set into motion. Judas, one of Jesus' 12 disciples, had betrayed him and showed up with a big armed crowd to arrest Jesus. To be clear, it didn't really matter what kinds of weapons they had, because if Jesus had wanted to defend himself, he could have. But Jesus allowed himself to be taken, and his disciples scattered and ran. Over the next few hours, Jesus was accused before everyone with a claim to power. First, he was brought to the courtyard of the high priest. They kept trying to come up with some reason to kill him, and since they were pretty motivated, they eventually just kind of made one up. Next, this group of priests brought Jesus to a Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, and tried to make Jesus seem like a political threat. Now, Pilate didn't really see the problem, but he wasn't about to stick his neck out there for a guy who wouldn't even defend himself. And so Pilate, realizing that Jesus was born in Galilee, wanted to pass the buck and sent Jesus over to a local leader, Herod. Like Pilate, Herod didn't really see why Jesus was such a big deal. He basically determined that Jesus was a joke and sent him back to Pilate. Bottom line, only this group of corrupt priests who knew what God was really about understood the threat Jesus posed to their grip on controlling very goodness. So they're the ones who insisted Jesus be crucified. And Pilate, who believed that his own very goodness depended on keeping order, just let it happen. And so it did. To be clear, crucifixion sucks. Because it's not just painful, it's slow on purpose and intentionally humiliating. And the Roman soldiers who carried out Jesus' crucifixion were all about humiliating Jesus. And because these soldiers lived in the reality of the lie, they didn't have any concept of the upside-down purpose of Jesus' death. And they extremely ironically ended up making fun of Jesus for exactly the things that would ultimately bring him glory. They mocked the claim that he was king by making him wear a crown of thorns, not knowing that their actions would make him king of a new kingdom. They taunted him with sour wine, which he refused to take, not knowing that Jesus, as the source of very goodness, didn't need anything from them. They challenged him to save himself, not knowing that by not saving himself, he was saving them. Jesus was winning, and they couldn't see it. But I don't want to paint too rosy of a picture. Jesus was in agony. He hurt like everyone else. In his body as it bled and hung and as he gasped for breath, and in his heart for the betrayal of the world. But to the end, Jesus resisted the temptation to save himself. He resisted the temptation to exercise his authority. He resisted the temptation to make his own very goodness. And then he really did die. He really was vulnerable to death, just like us. He really did cover both sides of the deal with Abraham and his family with his own blood. He really did trust in God's very goodness all the way to death. And when he died, the earth shook, and the veil in the temple was torn in two, and the rock split and the tombs were open. And immediately, people started to realize that Jesus was exactly who he said he was. But even his own disciples didn't trust that Jesus could do what he said that he was going to do. They didn't believe that he was powerful enough to bring life from death. And so Jesus' followers mourned. They wrapped his body and placed it in a tomb. And since Jesus had foretold that he would be raised from death, the authorities covered the tomb with a large stone and set guards out to make sure that he stayed put. But Jesus didn't stay put. That Sunday morning after the Sabbath, the women who had been a part of Jesus' band of followers went to his tomb to take care of his body with spices. When they arrived, the earth quaked, and the stone in front of the tomb rolled away, but the tomb was empty. According to the angel who was chilling outside, Jesus had risen from death, just as he said. And soon that was abundantly clear, because Jesus appeared first to the women, then to his disciples, and then to a whole bunch of other people a whole bunch of other times over the next 40 days. The risen Jesus had a real body. He ate and he drank and he bore the wounds of his crucifixion. And this was particularly helpful because even his own disciples insisted on touching him to make sure that he was real and really there. But Jesus was there for them to touch and see. Jesus was there to offer forgiveness in person to the disciples who had run away from him. So now the disciples knew. They knew that the truth was the truth. They knew that very goodness comes from God. They knew that God's promise to bless them was real, that he really did love them enough to cover their side of the deal with his own blood. They knew that he really did have the power to bring very goodness no matter what, even in the face of death itself. So after 40 days, Jesus reminded them of their partnership mission, that they were blessed so that they could bless the world. He told them, "Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all I have commanded you. And behold, I am always with you to the end of the age." But not long after he said that he would always be with them, he ascended, still alive, into heaven. Which leaves us with the question, what now? How would his disciples convince the world of his resurrection without his body? How would the impact of Jesus' death and resurrection continue once these witnesses died? How could they live in the truth without him there? The disciples were going to need help. And the very good news was that help was on the way.